Chapter 17 of D99 by H.B. Fyfe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17. John Willard set a brisk pace through the streets of First Haven, as befitted a conscientious public servant. Maria Ringstad kept up with him as best she could. When she lagged, the thin cord tightened around her wrist, and he grumbled over his shoulder at her. Naturally, she carried her bag. He had explained that they would have been most inconspicuous with her walking properly a yard behind him. Anyone would then have taken them for a man and wife, or a man and servant, had it not been for her Terran clothing. To walk the street with you in that rig would attract entirely too much attention, was his explanation. The only thing we can do is use the public symbol of restraint, so that everyone will know you are a prisoner. What good will that do? Won't they still stare? It is considered improper as well as imprudent. No law-abiding citizen would wish to risk being suspected of a sympathetic curiosity about a transgressor. You make it sound dangerous, said Maria, holding out her hand obediently. Anything to be inconspicuous, she had thought. Now, turning a corner about 300 yards from the jail, she had to admit that the system seemed to be working. The greenies whom they met were nearly all interested in other things. A shop in the vicinity, another greenie across the street, a paving stone over which they had just tripped, or the condition of the wall above Maria's head. Willard led her to the far side of a broader avenue after they had negotiated the corner that put them permanently out of sight of the jail. Maria tried to recall the scanty information he had whispered to her against the outside wall of the prison. There had been time for him to tell her he was sent by the Department of Interstellar Relations of Terra to get her out, since it had proved impossible to alter the attitude of the Greenie legal authorities. Maria was not quite sure whether he was really the prison officer he said he was, in which case he must have been bribed on a scale to make her own crime ridiculous, or whether he was an independent worker friendly to the Terran space line, in which case the payment might more charitably be regarded as a fee. She knew that he planned to deliver her to a spaceship due to leave shortly. There had been no opportunity for her to ask the destination. To tell the truth, she reflected, I don't care what it is. Anything would be a haven from Greenhaven. She began to amuse herself by planning the article she would write when back on Terra. How I Escaped from Paradise might do it, or Prison Breaking in Paradise, or perhaps Green Haven or Green Hell. Whatever I call it, she promised herself, I'll skin them alive, and I'll find a way to send the judge and the warden copies of it too. Maybe, she pondered, it might even be better to stretch it out to a whole book, and get someone to do a series of unflattering cartoons of greenie characters. The cord jerked at her wrist. She realized that she had fallen behind again, and made an apologetic face at Willard when he looked back. Don't do that, he hissed. They'll wonder why I tolerate disrespect. Sorry, said Maria, shrugging unrepentantly. You take this pretty seriously, don't you? You'd better take it seriously yourself, he growled. It's your neck as much as mine. He glared at a young greenie who had glanced curiously from the opposite side of the avenue. The abashed citizen hastily averted his eyes. Willard gave the cord a significant twitch and strode on. They turned another corner, to the right this time, and went along a narrow side street for about 200 yards. Waiting for a moment when he might meet as few people as possible, Willard crossed to the other side. A little further on, he led the way into what could almost be termed an alley. Willard stopped. Now we are going into the small food shop, he informed Maria. You would call it a cafe or restaurant on Terra. It will seem normal enough for an officer to provide his charge with food for a journey, so that will be reasonable. Is the food any better than what I've been getting? Asked Maria. It doesn't matter. We won't stop there, since it would be impolite to inflict the sight of you upon honest citizens at their meal. I shall request a private room, and the keeper will lead us to the rear. Humph! Well, if that's the way it is, then that's the way it is. So in the eyes of an honest greenie, I'm something to spoil his appetite? What can I do about that? What you can do is keep that big, flexible, active mouth of yours shut, declared Willard. Otherwise, I shall simply drop the end of the cord and take off. You can find your own way out. I'm sorry, apologized Maria, a shade too meekly. I promise I'll be oh so good. Do you want me to kneel down and lick your boots? Or will it be enough if I open a vein in the soup? It will be enough if I get out of this without committing murder, mumbled Willard. Now the expression is fine. Just wipe that grin off your mind and we'll go in. He pulled her along the few yards to the entrance of the food shop. He opened the door and entered. Maria followed at a respectful distance. There were a half a dozen greenies eating plain, wholesome meals at plain, sturdy tables and exchanging a plain, honest word now and then. The sight of the cord on Maria's wrist counterbalanced the sight of her lascivious Terran costume, and they kept their eyes on their food after one startled glance. A greenie woman stood at a counter at one side of the food shop, and Willard made known his desire for a private dining room. A man cooking something that might have been stew looked around from his labor at a massive but primitive stove to the rear of the counter. Maria thought he took an unusual interest in her compared to what she had been observing recently. It rather helped her morale, and she thought she did not blame the man if the counterwoman were his wife. The latter now came from behind her little fortress and led the way to a door at the rear of the shop. Willard followed, and Maria trailed along, restraining an impulse to wink at the cook. She was conscious of his analytical stare until the door had closed behind her. Willard seemed to have nothing to say to the greeny woman, and Maria relented to the point of heeding his request to be silent. All this made for a solemn little procession. They walked along a short hall, and the greeny woman opened another door to a flight of stairs. What surprised Maria was that the stairs led down. She shrugged. On Greenhaven they had their own peculiar ways. She was more puzzled when, at the bottom of the steps, they seemed to be in an ordinary cellar. The light was dim, and she did not succeed in catching the look on Willard's face. She began to wonder if she might wind up buried under a basement floor, while he spent his ill-gotten bribe. Then the greeny woman pulled aside a large crate and opened another door. To pass through this one they all had to stoop. Maria realized that they were then in the cellar of another building. The blocks of stone forming the walls looked damp and dirty. They proceeded to climb stairs again, and to traverse another hall. Maria thought they ended up going in a direction away from the street. The woman led them through a small, dark series of rooms, and finally into one with windows set too high in the walls to see out. There she halted and faced Willard. The greeny prison official dropped the cord and reached into an inner pocket of his drab uniform. He withdrew a thick packet of Greenhaven currency. The numbers and units were too unfamiliar for Maria to guess at the value from one quick glance, but the attitude of their hostess suggested that it was substantial. Willard handed it over. Maria decided it was time to set down her bag. The woman went immediately to a large chest in a corner of the room and opened it. She set aside a mirror she took out of the chest, then began to pull out other objects. There was a case which she handed to Willard, and a great many articles of clothing that were probably considered feminine on this world. "The point is," Willard said in low tones, "you are going to have proper clothes to look natural on the street. See if that dress will fit you." Maria took the thing distastefully, but it looked to be about the right length when she held it up against her. The greeny woman nodded. She added a sort of full-length flannel slip and a petticoat to the dress. "Now I know why the greeny women look so grim," said Maria. "It would be almost worth dying to stay out of such a rig." "Hold your tongue," said Willard. Maria made a face. "Present company accepted, of course," she added. "Change," ordered Willard. "We have no time to waste." He took the mirror and a small case to a rude table under one of the windows. He opened the box so that Maria caught a glimpse of the contents, which looked like an actor's makeup kit. The greeny woman joggled Maria's elbow and spoke for the first time. "I must not be long, or it will be noticed," she hinted. "Give her your clothes to burn and get into the others," said Willard, bending over the table with his back to her. "As soon as I get myself fixed here, I'll change your face too." Maria looked about in a manner to suggest that she hoped they knew what they were doing. The greeny woman waited. Maria reached up and began to unbutton her blouse. She dropped it across her bag. The woman picked both of them up and waited. She looked a trifle shocked at the sight of the thin slip when Maria unzipped her skirt and hauled it over her head. By the time the slip followed, she was standing with downcast eyes. Maria eyed the broad back and the drab uniform as she unfastened her brasserie. This would make a good story someday, but to tell it in the wrong company might be to invite catty remarks about her attractiveness. She could think of other men who might not have kept their backs so rigidly turned as did Willard. It was almost provocative. She slipped down the brief panties, stepped out of them, and handed them over. The greeny woman pointed silently to the shoes. Maria kicked them off, and they were added to the pile. She hoped that whatever was in the chest for footwear would not be too hard to walk in. The greedy woman thrust the flannel atrocity at her and left the room hastily. Maria watched the door close softly, then held the garment out at arm's length. It did not look any better. She took a few steps toward Willard. "I bet I could make him faint dead away," she thought mischievously. "I'd love to see the look on his face if... Well, why not? I will." "She's gone," she announced in a low voice. "How do I get into this thing?" Willard looked around, and the look was nothing she had ever seen before. His face appeared fuller in the cheeks. His eyebrows were black and heavy, his nose high at the bridge, and his whole complexion was darker. He nodded at her gasp. "Those papers I turned in for you won't last too long. The estimate is that they will dissolve before tomorrow morning, but that this might come apart sooner. If he sends out an alarm, I don't want to be on the streets in shape to be recognized." "That's wonderful," said Maria enthusiastically. "Are you going to make me up, too?" "Yes," said Willard. "Get into those things so I can start." Maria watched his eyes flicker to her breasts, and then sweep down the rest of her body. She thought he was taking it very well, unless it was the makeup. "Will you help me with this thing?" she begged. "I never saw one before." She held out the flannel garment with a helpless smile, planting the other hand on her bare hip. "Will you quit teasing, you little bitch?" Willard snapped. "I'm no greenie, if that's what you thought. You could get us involved to the point of missing the ship." Maria felt her eyes popping. A tingling hot flush lit her face. It spread back to her neck and crept down to her breasts. She snatched the flannel sack to her and turned her back. Somehow she maneuvered it over her head. Then she fumbled on the starched petticoat and topped the hole with a dun-colored dress that fell chastely about her ankles. Willard handed her a pair of low-heeled shoes that were only a little loose when she put them on. He had her stand facing one of the windows while he darkened her face and put a black wig on her. She looked up at the window and stood very still. "Now listen," said Willard. "You'll absolutely have to stop blushing like that, or the color of the skin is going to come all wrong." "I can't help it," she said meekly. Then she saw he was laughing at her, and gave him a rueful smile. "Where did all that modesty come from?" "It was the shock, I suppose." "All right, it was funny. When we get out on the street again, forget all about what's funny. Look like a serious greenie." "Funny?" objected Maria. "I always thought I made a pretty fair showing in comparison to local gals." "Oh, you did. You did. One of the best showings I've ever seen." He pressed a hand to each side of her waist, then slid them up her ribs until the weight of her breasts rested against his wrists. "We'll talk about this again when we make it to the ship," he told her in a low voice. "Right now it would be foolish to spoil this makeup." He turned away after a long moment and returned the kit to the chest. They left by the same door by which they had entered, but Willard knew a short way out to a different street. Maria thought it must be the one outside the high windows. He set off at a businesslike pace. They traveled about a quarter of a mile, counting several turns by which he sacrificed directness for sparsely peopled streets. The disguises must have been effective, for they drew no second glances. It was not until she saw the gibbet that Maria realized they were approaching the outskirts of the city. "What?" she began, sensing the reality of her plight for the first time. "Quiet! Look the other way if you must, but don't be obvious about it." Several examples of rigid Greenhaven justice were on exhibit to a modest crowd. 3 men and 2 women sat in stocks. They were not, apparently, subject to rock throwing or other abuse, as Maria seemed to remember had been the custom on ancient Terra. But they were clearly unhappy and mortified. From the gibbet behind them swung the body of a hanged man. It appeared to have been there for some time. Maria wondered what he had done to corrupt the morals or the economics of Greenhaven. What nearly made her sick was the sight of a party of 24 children being guided on a tour of the place. One youngster whined and was thoroughly cuffed by the greenie in charge. Then they were passed, and Maria saw the high cyclone fence of the Terran spaceport. Willard took a look at her face. Seemingly satisfied, he explained that they had come to a section well away from the main entrance. He had her along the fence for perhaps 100 yards, found a small gate, and unlocked it with a key produced from under his belt. Maria, remembering their exit from the jail, was not surprised to feel a good-natured slap on the bottom as she stepped into Terran land. There was another quarter mile to go, but it was open land. "We have made it now," said Willard, locking the gate behind them. They bypassed the administration and custom buildings, and headed directly for the field elevator beside the waiting spaceship, ignoring the possibility of causing inquiries to be made by local eagle eyes who might think they had seen 2 greenies board the vessel. "Willard, of the Department of Interstellar Relations," he introduced himself to a surprised ship's officer. "You've been told to expect Miss Ringstad." The officer, staring in bald disbelief at Maria's costume, admitted that the ship was more or less being held for her arrival. "One thing was unexpected," said Willard. "I am exercising my authority to demand a cabin for myself as well. I have reason to suspect that my disguise has been penetrated, which, of course, makes it very dangerous for me." "Of course," agreed the officer. "Let's go, by all means." "Yes," said Maria. "I want to get out of this awful rig." "That's what I meant," said Willard. There was no doubt that the influence behind Willard had held the ship for them. It rose as soon as they could reach a pair of tiny cabins. Later, after the first surge of the takeoff, there were a number of delays stretching between minor course corrections. Finally, it was announced over the public address system that because of precautionary checking of the course, there would be no spin to simulate planetary gravity for about 2 hours. Maria hoped that she would not be revealed as the cause to the disgruntled passengers. She was still considering this and trying to disentangle herself from the acceleration net slung in the 10-foot cubicle they were pleased to call a cabin, when Willard arrived. "I made friends with some of the crew," he announced. "Everybody likes to help out a DIR agent. It must strike them as romantic." "They should know," said Maria, thinking of the long, suspenseful walk through Greenhaven streets. "There was a stewardess who had extra slacks and blouse about your size." "You must have a good eye," she told him. "Or you think you have, anyhow. First, get me out of this thing. What with this greeny outfit, too, I might as well be in a straitjacket." He pushed himself over to the net and began to open the zipper. She saw that he had taken time to remove his greeny face. Her first motion, when the net was open, sent her tumbling head over heels to the far bulkhead. "Keep a grip on something," laughed Willard. "Here, I brought a small kit along. Let me fix your face." She obediently clung to the anchoring shock springs at one end of the net, and turned her face up so that he could work on the mask he had earlier painted on. His fingers were gentle, smoothing in the cream he had brought and rubbing off the makeup with lightly perfumed tissues. Maria closed her eyes luxuriously and thought how pleasant it was to be off Greenhaven. "Was it very complicated getting me out of there?" she asked. "There were a lot of angles to think of," he answered. "But we pulled it off as slickly as I've ever seen done. Just strolled right through them all. Things in this business don't often go that well to plan. There, now you look human again, just like when I started to put that face on you." "Not exactly," smiled Maria, plucking ruefully at the native Mother Hubbard, which billowed hideously about her in the zero gravity. "That's easily changed," Willard said, meeting her smile significantly. "See if you can find your way out any better than you did getting into it, while I sort out the clothes I got for us." Between the reaction from the strain of the past few hours and a glow of gratitude toward her rescuer, Maria began to sense the stir of an emotion within her that took a few moments to recognize. It surprised her a little. "Willard," she said lazily, "it's funny, but I feel just as if I'm falling in love with you." "That's interesting," grinned the agent. "About time, too." "I can't tell if my knees are weak," she went on, laying a hand on his shoulder to draw herself closer, "because I'm hanging in midair, but you always seem to be making me strip, and I find myself not minding." "I don't mind either," he assured her. When his arm slipped around her waist and he kissed her, Maria was sure. She let her lips part gradually, trembling as the fever rose in her. "Let me go a minute," she murmured. Presently, after a few weightless contortions, the muffling Greenhaven flannels were sent swirling into a corner. Maria laughed softly as she set a bare foot against the bulkhead to launch herself back into Willard's arms. End of chapter 17.